Hey campers, this is NPS Ranger News. Our program features the amazing work of National Park Service Rangers, protecting people and parks across the country through law enforcement, search and rescue, emergency medicine, firefighting, and other emergency services. I'm Greg Jackson, your host. NPS Ranger News updates news stories every day as they happen, both on Facebook and Twitter. On Facebook, find us at /NPS Ranger News. On Twitter, we're at NPS_Ranger. With me today is Dick Martin. Dick retired as superintendent from Sequoia Kings Canyon National Park. Before that, he was superintendent at Death Valley National. Was it a monument at the time, Dick?
No, it was a month-old national park.
A month-old national park. So right there during the transition. Before that, he was in the Washington office, a.k.a. WASO, in ranger activities. Did I get that?
Yep, uh-huh.
Okay. You want to go over through the string before that?
Sure. I can work backwards if you like.
Okay, go ahead.
Before that, I was the superintendent at Wrangell St. Elias in Alaska, the second superintendent when it was a new park. And prior to that, the Valley District Ranger in Yosemite for actually several years. I was a wilderness supervisor in Sequoia and Kings Canyon. Prior to that, district ranger at Mount Rainier, and a supervisory ranger and a beginning ranger at Olympic National Park.
So plenty. Where in Olympic?
Actually, I used to call myself the infield utility ranger because I worked at Claylock, I worked at Staircase, I worked at Heart of the Hills at Hurricane Ridge, and I worked at the Elwha.
The Heart of the Hills.
And I think I was the most mobile of the permanents they had at the time, so they were always moving me around. But it was a wonderful experience, great park, and a great beginning, actually, for me anyway, in NPS.
I spent some time there too and enjoyed it quite much. We could get into stories about that sometime, but what I'd like to do today is talk a bit about your time in Washington, specifically about something called Ranger Careers. This is why, if there are any GL9, formerly GS9 level park rangers out there, this is why you're not a GS7 or a GS5. Dick, could you tell me a bit about the Ranger Careers Initiative and how that started and what were the driving forces behind it?
Sure. I'm glad to, actually. It's a subject dear to my heart, and I'm really pleased that you and hopefully others are interested in this subject because it's a real learning lesson, and I know there's a few of us, old folks, that feel there's still a few additional things that would help the ranger professionalization and the range function in the National Park Service for the occupants and their careers, but also for the Park Service. It actually began a very unauspicious beginning, but way back at the very beginnings of the Association of National Park Rangers, ANPR, back in the 70s. A lot of us were really concerned about what we viewed as kind of a drifting of the park ranger occupation. The Park Technician series had been initiated actually in the early 70s. Park technicians were supposed to be what today are referred to as visitor use assistants or as technicians of various kinds, kind of the support services for park rangers. But it didn't work out that way. Park technicians ended up writing management plans and becoming supervisors and all kinds of stuff. So it was just really mismanaged, A. But B was the increasing specialization of all functions, not just in National Park Service, but, throughout various occupations. So that was B. There were becoming, professional resource managers and professional planners and other occupations in the National Park Service. And they, of course, were in some cases taking over many functions that had been at one time the responsibility of park rangers, wildlife management being one of those, but only one of many. But the third thing was the law enforcement issue. Because of increased visitation in almost all of particularly the well-known popular parks, A and B, and also because of increased focus by news media and the public in what park rangers were doing in these busy parks. And of course, the epitome of that was the riot in Yosemite, which created a huge stink. And so law enforcement was becoming way more important. There was also increased emphasis on expanding other ranger occupations from a technical standpoint or even professional. Search and rescue was becoming more technical. It was no longer the art of, we used to call it muddling through, not knowing what we were doing, but, doing something and hoping it worked out for a search or a rescue. EMS was becoming standardized and required training and focus. So there was all of these subjects that were swirling around the park ranger occupation. I remember particularly, I dealt with a lot of bears at Olympic and Mount Rainier. And of course, we had also done, not myself personally, but rangers that participated in elk reductions in places like Yellowstone and other kinds of wildlife management matters. Not particularly at what one would call a professional level, but we did it at what we viewed as the state of knowledge that we had at the time. Well, Park Service got a few, professional, in the case of, say, wildlife management, bears in particular, in my experience, professional wildlife managers that were, doing the, quote, bear management in places like Yosemite and Sequoia Kings and Yellowstone and some other parks. So I was no longer qualified to dart a bear. I didn't meet the qualifications anymore, even though I'd been doing it off and on for 15 years. So there were those kinds of things, and it seemed like it was like a hit or miss, no management, no focus way of doing so many of these things that we were really, really kind of concerned that NPS wasn't focusing really on what it is, A, that rangers should be doing, B, that they needed to be trained to do, and C, adequately equipped and supervised to do. So we started a little group that we called our Ranger Occupation Group. There was 3 of us on the group at the time, and we muddled along for many, many years as part of Association of National Park Rangers. And we'd have meetings, and we'd talk, and we'd occasionally try to get the attention of human resource folks or regional office people or the Washington office, and we'd have a few meetings. And at one point, we managed to get enough pressure on the Washington office that they decided to do away with the Park Technician series so that everybody would be called a park ranger. Well, the title changed for everybody, but it really, really diminished the occupation because the park ranger occupation, which had been GSO 2.5, had been a 579 occupation. And oftentimes it was in some cases like it is today where you could get entry GS5 and get promoted after 6 months to or maybe a year to GS7 and after another year to GS9 if you performed appropriately. Well, that changed when they fused the park technician and the park ranger function together.
And this was in the early mid-'80s, wasn't it?
This was in the sometime in the 1980s. As I recall, it was kind of the late 1980s, but I'm not sure.
Okay.
I could look up the year at some point, but it would take quite a bit of digging. But anyway,
okay.
About the 1980s, the Park Technician and Park Ranger series got fused into one series, the GSO 2.5 series. Everybody was called a park ranger from GS3 to on up to as far as you went in the ranger function, chief rangers. And in some cases, regional chief rangers and rangers in the Washington office. But each step required competition. If you were a GS3, you had to compete to be a GS4. If you were a GS5, you needed to compete to be a GS6. If you were a GS6, you needed to compete to be a 7 and on up until you were a GS9. Now, you could often times go, if you were a GS9, 2 steps to GS11. I don't recall too many GS10s, although I do seem to recall a few.
Yeah.
You had to compete at each level.
And at that time, the GS9 was a first-line supervisor, wasn't it?
Not necessarily. The GS8s could supervise law enforcement.
Okay.
And some other narrow ranger functions.
And there were
in some cases, there were actually GS-8 police officers. I've forgotten the series for police officers.
083, wasn't it?
I'm sorry?
083?
083, yeah. There were some GS-083s doing law enforcement work and supervisory work in the National Park Service at that time, and some, not very many, but in a few parks. And there were no standard position descriptions. every park.
Everybody wrote their own
for these various functions.
What could go wrong?
It was just crazy, and it was a simple example of the human resource function in the National Park Service not getting itself organized. And I don't mean to diminish those folks, because they were all working really hard at doing what they believed their jobs were. But it created this really horrible situation just for an individual if you wanted to make a career as a park ranger. The other downside to this, of course, was, aside from the chaos it created, was if you happen to be a GS, say you got to be a GS5 and you had a permanent job, you could easily transfer your job with that training and experience you had into another agency and enter a GS5, 7, 9 career with another agency. The big ones at that time, BLM, Bureau of Land Management, was expanding its BLM Ranger program then. It had just started its Ranger program a few years earlier. And they started originally as they called them Desert Rangers, I think in the Southern California desert. Anyway, they were expanding their BLM Ranger program, and they were recruiting. And they would hire a person from the National Park Service as a GS5 or 7, promote them to GS9 after in a formal stepladder career, the target grade being GS9. You compete once as a GS5. If you do the job appropriately, you get promoted to GS9 routinely, as park rangers are today. But it wasn't that way in the Park Service. And that drifted on it was still occurring in 1990 when several of us that had been involved with the Association of National Park Rangers and their initiative to try to get this improved began to realize that if we're going to improve the ranger function and make some sense out of it, it's going to be important for us to do it in a way where we actually have some influence, and in ways that actually will make a difference that is positive, and positive not just for us in the occupation, but positive for the National Park Service and national parks, and in a way that gains support. And there were other reasons for it why many of us transferred to Washington, D.C. But in the case of several of us, that was at least one of the items on our agenda. There easily were, in some cases, other items on folks' agendas as well. As you know, ranger activities in those days did all kinds of stuff with fee collection, wilderness management, search and rescue, EMS, law enforcement, of course, as well as, things like fee collection and the regulation program and a few other things. So there were several of us that had our own agendas that were high on our list, or there was, in some cases, like there were a couple of folks that were in Washington, D.C. in ranger activities who were essentially leaders of the search and rescue community. I mean, leaders in a world-class fashion, and several of those are still well known today. There were folks who understood law enforcement really intimately. I wasn't one of them, and understood that what the ins and outs and the details were. There were a couple of us that realized that in addition to what the park ranger was doing in this life, that the Park Service really needed people to do follow-up criminal investigations. The big example for me, anyway, in my experience, was wildlife poaching in Alaska. There recently was an article about poaching of trophy-sized Dall sheep in Wrangell St. Elias National Park, just in the last few weeks here today. And the amount of money folks will spend for a trophy-sized Dall sheep, beautiful heads, and the size of the curl on the head of the Dall sheep is graded, and the bigger the curl is on a Dall sheep, the higher grade you get in the hunting community. I don't know if it's the Boone and Crockett Club or Safari International or one of those outfits. If you get a big head, say a curl and a quarter, you are right up there among the world-class Dall sheep head folks with it hanging on your wall. And people pay tens of thousands of dollars for a sheep like that. Well, the park rangers working in a place like Wrangell's, at least when I was there were 3 permanents for 13 million acres. The rangers did not have the time, or in some cases, the connections, with other agencies like Fish and Wildlife Service investigators, or say state fish and game departments, to follow up and do all of the detailed digging, investigative-wise, to figure out who had done this particular poaching incident, or any of several, and follow up to figure out how to get evidence against the person and bring them into court. So there was that focus as well, and that's so there were folks working on that in Washington D.C. at the same time. Ranger careers-wise, there were several of us that really wanted to get that changed and improved. We realized what we had been doing hadn't been effective, and when there were several of us in Waves in Washington D.C. I was only one of several that worked closely with the human resource staff, really closely, became good friends with them, and got support from them, and gave our support as well. We got connections with the Office of Personnel Management, and we got connections in the Department of Interior, both human resources and in the law enforcement function in the Department of Interior. We reached across various other functions, U.S. Marshals, in those days what was called the Border Patrol. We discussed various ways of creating a career with other organizations. We looked at professional organizations or occupations such as wildlife, various resource management occupations, as well as cultural resource occupations. Oh, that was another field where investigations we felt were really necessary, was in the field of archaeological resource protection. Looting of archaeological resources required a lot of investigative work to figure out, who on earth and how are we going to get this person charged after they stole valuable archaeological resources from, you think of the Southwest parks primarily, but not exclusively. We went to, it seemed like dozens of meetings to talk about the ranger function, per se. And fortunately, with Director Ridenour on the 75th anniversary, one of the folks that was helping with this, and had been a help from the start way back in the 70s, was a great guy, good friend of mine, Bob Cunningham. He retired as the superintendent of the South Arizona Parks. He was on the committee for the 75th anniversary, and one of his missions in life was to try to get into the 75th anniversary records an objective for the National Park Service to professionalize the ranger occupation in the National Park Service. And he succeeded in getting that wording into the report from the 75th anniversary. And he also got support from the director of OPM at the time. I cannot remember her name, but she was supportive of professionalizing the ranger function as well. So that became a service-wide objective then, this professionalizing a ranger career. So then we had an ability to get around to meetings and propose various things. And we came up, and this was Jim Brady's really great idea, to call this thing we were pursuing Ranger Futures. What's the Ranger of the future going to be like? And we went to dozens, in some cases hundreds, it seemed like, meetings, and talked about the Ranger of the future, the Ranger of the future, the Ranger of the future, till we were blue in the face. But we didn't give up. And Bill Sanders, we were able to get him to come to Wausau to do a lot of the detail work on writing position descriptions. And these were proposals at the time.
Sure.
Proposed
just to go over
position descriptions.
Sure. Just to go over the cast of characters here. Jim Brady was the chief of Ranger Activities?
Yes, that's right.
And you were the deputy chief?
It was a combination of the deputy chief, and I was also called the chief of resource and visitor protection.
Okay. And then Bill Sanders came in as a project manager for Ranger Futures?
Yeah, he was a park ranger, but his job was to manage the Ranger Futures function from a detail standpoint.
Got it. Okay. Just trying to get the players on the scorecard.
So the three of us basically were really hard. We also had, other jobs to do at the same time, a whole bunch of other jobs. It seemed like we were nonstop working. Not that we didn't take occasional time out to go to a bar or something and tell stories, but we worked really hard on this from about 92 or 3 to 95 anyway. Going to meetings, discussing, arguing, persuading, responding to concerns. Got to remember, this was the same time we were trying to do health and fitness guidelines. We were working really hard doing expanding the search and rescue function and EMS functions. We were working hard to get the wilderness management programs in the Park Service so that they were a little more cohesive. Fee collection was a big thing then because of the fee dollars, the fee money coming in, and the trying to get fee money into national parks rather than into the general treasury. So a whole bunch of other stuff going on.
And was this about the same time that all of the manuals were transformed from back when from RM9 switching to, or from NPS 9 switching from RM and whatever's above an RM?
Yeah, whatever it is today, aren't they? DOs today or something?
DOs.
About that time, but...
so a lot of paperwork going
Yeah, I think that might have been just a little toward the end when that began.
Okay.
Because I know I wasn't personally too involved in that. But at any rate, there was all kinds of other stuff going on, and we were all working really hard, and we were really chugging away here. And occasionally we'd go, oh, Lord, when are we going to get this hopefully done to where we believe it needs to go? There was a lot of answering of concerns, problems. Oh, geez, am I going to, is it going to result in a diminishment of diversity efforts in the ranger function? Am I going to be able to, do the health and fitness guidelines? A lot of paranoia that this was going to impact some folks, and I don't blame them. One of the big concerns, particularly among park managers, was it'll cost too much money. It'll cost too much money, which is just, how that goes. That's a big, big, big deal in national parks. Well, all the GS5s are all of a sudden going to become GS9s over, say, a year or two, and where am I going to get the money in my big or little park? Bigger parks, of course, better off than the smaller ones with financial flexibility. So what we did successfully is we were able to convince the Washington Office Budget Office, Bruce Schaefer, who I know they're detractors of Bruce around, but I am a huge admirer of Bruce Schaefer and his ability. He's retired now, too, of course. That we could try to get a line item budget in the National Park Service budget for Ranger careers. And Roger Kennedy was the director by then, and he supported it. We were able to get the department to support it, and we even made pilgrimages over to the Office of Management and Budget and sat in their windowless offices around these square Formica tables. No, I don't know how some of those people can take their work. But anyway, and talk to them about, the necessities. And, of course, none of them. There actually was one guy in the Office of Management and Budget that made a big effort to understand the Park Service and the ranger occupation. I can't remember his name. But I actually had lunch with this guy a couple of times. We became kind of semi-friends, and he became supportive, OMB guy. So we were able to get a few of those folks, on our court. And anyway, there was a line item budget item in the National Park Service budget for, I forget if it was 94, 95, 96, somewhere in there, for several $1 million generally to be distributed to parks for ranger careers. So there was all kinds of other ramifications to this. But anyway, we kept chugging away, working away, and poor Bill Sanders, he was writing and rewriting position descriptions, had mounds of paper on his desk, and was talking to human resources in some cases, multiple times a day. And it wasn't just the NPS human resources, it was the department as well. And there was all this stuff going on. Anyway, we finally I think just as I was leaving Wausau in '95, Roger Kennedy signed the Ranger Careers document, and it became National Park Service policy that the GS 579 occupation would be the Park Ranger 025 in the National Park Service. And there would be the standards for that. And there would be a separate series, the Visitor Use Assistant series, to do work that did not require the same qualifications or abilities as the Park Ranger occupation. Park Ranger occupation was designed to be self-supervising, work whether you're working in a team or a group or directly with other rangers, or whether you're out, someplace in the wilds of Wrangell St. Elias or Denali or Yellowstone or wherever it was, and you got up in the morning and you generally might know generally what you were doing, but you could decide whether, you were going to focus on X or Y for that particular day. And so it was designed as a self-supervising occupation. Whereas the Visitor Use Assistant, close supervision, detail work, few qualifications. You didn't have to have law enforcement training, search and rescue training, EMS training, and in some cases fire training or some of these other professional occupations in order to do Visitor Use Assistant work. So a clear line of distinction between the professional park ranger and those folks doing those support services.
How was the...
And Kennedy signed it in about '95, and it's, as I know it's not perfect. And there's, if you wanted to go into what both Bill Sanders and I believe still need to be done, we can do that maybe, but if you'd prefer to focus then somewhat at this point on the 6C issue or any other specific issues.
Well, let's do both.
Greg, whatever your thoughts are.
Let's do a bit of both. One, we'll start off with the 6C as part of the process, because the grade level was certainly a big factor in getting people up to the GS9 level. Certainly helped out. But the retirement issue, it's always a mixed bag. It's a benefit. Yeah. It's a benefit until you're dealing with a bunch of people who are retiring in their 50s.
Yes. And those of us that were dealing with this in Wausau understood that, but few field rangers did. And I don't necessarily blame them. I mean, if you're out working every day, are you going to look into the details of your occupation? Unless somebody brings it to your attention, probably not. And of course, there's the matter of that's the situation for wildland fire in the National Park Service and in other agencies, Forest Service, BLM. So when you're working as a ranger or firefighter or whatever, it's this is a pretty good deal. I get to retire at 50. Is it 58 now?
There's waivers now, but it's 57 with 20. 57 is the mandatory age, and earlier. Yeah,
at 57. As I mentioned earlier, we were trying to set up this investigative function and get it formalized in the National Park Service to view what we believed was a necessity for resource protection in the National Park Service, not necessarily to investigate murders and car robberies and stuff like that. What we were trying to do, and I don't know that it worked out perfectly, but what we were trying to do was emulate what the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service does with their wildlife investigative function. Those folks deal with wildlife poaching crimes. That's what they do. They see a speeder in a Fish and Wildlife Service area. They don't go stop the speeder and write him a ticket. Their job is wildlife criminal investigations. And their GS, 083?
That's a police officer series.
No, it's the criminal investigative series.
1811.
1811, that's it. They are 1811s, and they retire at 57. They're investigators. That's what they do. They investigate resource management crimes, Lacey Act, and stuff like that. We wanted to emulate that for National Park Service resources, primarily, as I mentioned, for, at least in my view, wildlife poaching in places like Alaska, but not just, as well as when I worked in Olympic back in the 60s, there was a lot of elk poaching going on. Mm-hmm. And we worked really hard at trying to catch elk poachers, but of course we were rangers, and we were also, doing things like rescuing people, and in those days rangers fought fires as well, and other stuff. We didn't have time to go chasing around in the little communities trying to snoop out some anybody that had poached an elk. And that was, that's generally true in national parks. There are exceptions, of course,
sure,
thankfully, but generally true. Same with archaeological resources. So, and this was really Walt Dabney, who was Jim Brady's predecessor as the Chief of Ranger Activities. Great guy, Walt. Tremendous leader, actually, a really leadership guy. He had spent some time, while he was the Chief of Ranger Activities, he actually, for several weeks or months, he went on a detail with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, various places, seeing how they were managing their wildlife investigative function. And he came back and he said, this is something we should do in the National Park Service. And of course, he was absolutely right. And at the same time, the Archaeological Resources Protection Act had passed, as I recall, sometime in the late 80s, which made all archaeological resources in all federal lands protected, not just in national park areas. And we wanted to do a better job, and actually we did have some rangers actually help BLM and Bureau of Indian Affairs investigate some archaeological resource depredations. But anyway, so we wanted to set up an 1811 series for the National Park Service to do investigations of park resource crimes, not so much crimes against persons and property. So we did. We and the department that was an easy thing to convince Human Resources and Department to do, because the 1811 was a very established series throughout the federal government. There must be, 20 or 30 agencies that have 1811,
sure,
maybe more. So that was an easy thing to do. The PDs were, pretty standard, but they had 6C retirement. And they had higher grades than park rangers. Generally speaking, GS11 was the working level for 1811, or GS12, I believe. Is that not true?
Yes.
Yeah.
I'm saying that as an educated, it sounds good to me, guess.
Yeah. Yeah. I know for sure GS11 is a working level, and GS12 might be maybe generally, or maybe in some particular cases.
Yes.
Without supervision, working level. So the grade levels were higher in 1811. So some rangers, of course, that were particularly interested in that function, or maybe wanted a little more money. Actually, one of the results was a lot of rangers went on into the 1811 series in the National Park Service. But anyway, they had 6C retirement. They were doing pretty much full-time law enforcement investigative work of one kind or another in their jobs. So how does this relate to the park ranger function? And there really is a sticky wicket.
Sure.
Park rangers do law enforcement. Park rangers investigate felonies. Park rangers are authorized and do carry firearms, have authority to issue warrants, can arrest and detain people, and the Park Service needs rangers to do that kind of work. Park rangers from the beginning have done law enforcement. In many cases, way back in the 19-teens and 20s, a lot of it was wildlife protection, in the western parks anyway. But in other parks, in a lot of cases, it was protection of historical or archaeological or other cultural resources. The Park Service needs rangers to do law enforcement. They have to be trained. They have to be equipped. We had already started the standardization of the weapons for rangers. Up until about 93 or 4, the standard weapon for the National Park Service ranger was whatever was in the safe at the park, or whatever they happened to have on their hip when they went to work in the park. I remember I had this little old .38 Special that was World War II surplus revolver. 6 inches was my handgun. I'd been shooting rifles or long guns since I was 8 years old. I had my own Remington 12-gauge shotgun and my own I had my own 30-30. Wonderful little deer rifle. I loved that thing. I could shoot an eyeball out of a bird from, 100 feet anyway, maybe not 100 yards. But there was no standardization. You go to law enforcement training, you couldn't standardize the target shooting activity, because some of the revolvers had 5 bullets in the cylinder.
Some had 6.
Some of the rangers had started to get semi-automatics. One park, Joshua Tree, I don't know if you ever met Paul Henry. I know you heard of him at Plessy.
Sure.
A legend, law enforcement-wise in NPS. He was the chief ranger at Joshua Tree. We went out and bought for all all of his staff a bunch of Glocks. Don't blame him, because the weapon system for Rangers in the system was broke. So we standardized the weapons in the National Park Service. We led a contract, and Sig Sauer won the contract. That was, of course, an argument, a fight with one of the other handgun manufacturers. I forgot which one. We held prior to selecting a competitor, we had a 2-week trial of working park rangers at FLETC who came under supervision of a park police officer at FLETC and graded the various competitive guns handguns that had bid on our contract, and as well as standardizing with the Remington shotgun. What is it?
870.
870. Wonderful piece of equipment. So we need rangers to do law enforcement. How are we going to call them law enforcement officers? Well, the option is we could just call them 083s.
Dick, I'm going to take can you hear me now? So getting into the retirement issue, the dilemma or the multiple problems associated with the retirement issue. Where do you start, and where does it go from the start?
I don't know if you remember, Greg, or were involved, but back in the beginning, sometime around in the 80s, a few park rangers, particularly ones that did a lot of investigative work and dealt a lot with other agencies like the Fish and Wildlife Service or the FBI in some cases, or other investigative feds, began to realize they had a different retirement system, and they had higher grades. And particularly a few started lobbying and in some cases appealing their classification series and desired to become 1811s, and the Park Service was kind of fighting that for reasons I never could quite comprehend. Oh, we don't want rangers to just do law enforcement and stuff like that, which, I mean, the attitude was fine, but it didn't solve the issue of retirement. So when we were doing Ranger Careers, which was a few years later, but this was still ongoing, a whole bunch of rangers had appealed their classification in order to try to get 1811, or at least get the 6C retirement, which was viewed as a benefit. There wasn't quite that looking ahead to when I'm 57, am I going to have to leave and what am I going to do? So there was that. There was a whole bunch of these things that were floating around in the Human Resource Office in Washington, not knowing what to do. Plus, we had the issue of Ranger Careers and what to do about the ranger function from a law enforcement standpoint. If we said it was a law enforcement position, and that was 51% or more of the duties of the ranger, then it would be under 6C. And it would be very similar to the Park Service firefighters and firefighters and other federal agencies. If we say it's a non-law enforcement job, just kind of ancillary, it won't fall under 6C, but it won't be a law enforcement job. Well, what will it be? What will it be? Well, you know what it'll be? It'll be an 083 security type person, like GSA had.
Sure.
Well, do we want rangers to be 083s and have one-step grades, supervisors, that is, at GS 8 or 9, not working level, but supervisors, one-step series, compete at every level, non-professional, security-type law enforcement jobs. I mean, that's the federal system, the way it's set up.
Sure.
It's not, it doesn't work the same as a police department in a city or a sheriff's department in a county or even state law enforcement. It's the federal system. There's law enforcement positions, which are under 6C, and there are what they call police officer jobs, but they're really security type jobs.
Sure. And the difference is complexity of the investigations. Is that true?
Yeah. We wanted rangers to be able to do investigations. Maybe not full time, but we wanted them to be, and it was part of their job. If you were a commissioned ranger, investigations were part of what you were authorized to do. So there really was no choice except to go with 083 for law enforcement park rangers that we could see and still have rangers doing the kind of law enforcement that parks needed to have done. A park, say like Yosemite or Lake Mead or some of the other areas, might have an investigator or two on the staff and 1811 actually on the staff, or maybe close by in a regional office or central office someplace, or somebody they could call. But a lot of little parks, or ones with a small staff, or that were in kind of remote areas where it's expensive to send somebody, on per diem to go do an investigation, that wasn't going to happen. So they had to be able to do investigations, and that meant it was essentially an investigative job and a law enforcement job, and it would be under 6C. So that's how Rangers ended up having 6C retirement. And it does have its downsides for sure.
Sure.
In my view, there are ways. This is just me editorializing here, but I think it's a bit of a shame that there are fewer Rangers becoming superintendents.
Yes.
Or moving on to central office jobs where you can, have a broader influence in support of Ranger work.
And from what I've heard is that's been found out just from a operations standpoint. People who are looking for people with operational experience, the applicant pool's a little short that way. But it's also fixable in that there are, because of the early retirement, there are people who are being proactive in their career planning and are looking for detailed assignments as they get later in their careers. And it just takes it's not an easy bridge to build, and there's not enough for everybody, but people who are looking for opportunities can the right place at the right time are able to do it, but it's not an easy transition to make.
Yeah. Well, even in pre-6C, oftentimes, I remember somebody telling me one time, it was when I decided maybe I should apply for management jobs, because actually I felt I couldn't do the Ranger job quite the way I personally wanted to do. Well, you're identified too much as a Ranger, Dick. And this was before 6C. So I suspect that's a bigger challenge today, and that's a shame. But again, I admire people that are looking that far ahead and trying to figure out ways to do something else after they're 57, or even maybe transferring before they're 57. I always said I did not want to go under 6C myself. I was at a higher grade at the time anyway, but I didn't want to do that. I wanted to keep working.
Sure. And there were some people. I can think of a Ranger that really loved to do SAR up at Olympic National Park, that he didn't put in the paperwork for it because he wanted to work forever.
Which I believe he did, didn't he?
I think so. Yeah, he didn't put in the paperwork, and he stayed around for quite many years because he just didn't want to do that. So, on the way of kind of wrapping this up, unfinished business are things that were on the table that are on the work plan that didn't get finished.
Yeah, and I can't explain why it didn't get finished. There were some good Rangers came into Ranger activities after we left, and I don't know whether, it just wasn't part of, what Ranger activities wanted them to do, and they were, really busy doing their play. God knows we had more than enough to do when we all were there. Why, we used to say, in fact, if you call us on the phone, don't make it very long, because we got too much else to do. Or if they were discouraged I don't have a motivation, or maybe they just, were hoping the dust would settle and maybe time to move on at some later date. And, oftentimes that's true. And I continue to hope. Bill Sanders is really dedicated to this himself, I know, although neither one of us have figured out what to do about it. We had a plan, and I don't know if it's been formalized. I know Bill wrote stuff that should be in files someplace, or maybe he might have stuff. He's a quite meticulous guy, admirably so. The GS11 non-supervisory, and I think you reminded me that the idea was to call them something like Master Rangers or Senior Rangers or something like that, but also have an education requirement for GS11s and 12 and above Rangers, at least to the master's level degree in some park resource matter, such as, natural resources or cultural, above whatever. And I mean, there's like dozens and dozens of fields in those particular functions, in those particular knowledge systems, of 24 college level hours from an accredited university to qualify as a GS11 or 12 or above park ranger. And the reason for that was a couple. One is, make sure people knew about park resources and not just what the code of regulations and the law said, and how the carabiners worked on SARS and how to do an IV. That they actually were knowledgeable about park resources and had an interest in that, as well as in the function, which we thought was really a necessity, given the fact that the Park Service was not set up really to do law enforcement or search and rescue or EMS.
Yeah.
the Park Service was set up to conserve resources and provide enjoyment for the public. Those are the two functions. Not making arrests, giving IVs, dragging somebody out of a crevasse or off a cliff. Those are not the missions of the National Park Service. So the mission is resources. So we thought it was important from that standpoint as well, that anybody working in a professional occupation in the field in a National Park Service should have some educational background of an accredited nature in that function.
Sure.
Kind of like the firefighters, I believe. I meant, after we talked originally, to see if it's still true, but there was at least some emphasis in the federal firefighter community of requiring a 24 college hours, credit hours in natural resource conservation, or maybe in wildland firefighter science, in order to be a GS 11 or 12 in the federal firefighting community. I'm not positive that actually happened, but I did hear something about that at one time.
Okay. Yeah, I've seen the draft Master Ranger PD, and that was interesting. And something that when we were setting this up, I talked to you about was that other people had, if one were to look in the benchmark PD repository of the National Park Service, there is a non-supervisory GS 02511 position description that's approved there, and it was done by the folks over in interpretation. So it can be done. It can be done, and it's approved, but not in the traditional law enforcement / park ranger line so far.
And it's kind of like what we did. I hope it wouldn't be as big a challenge, and certainly if the interpreters succeeded in doing it, it doesn't seem to me like it would be that tough. It might be in the case of protection or law enforcement rangers that they might have to go through or have already had, some hours of academic training, which would be fine, in my view.
Yeah, it would. The aftermath of all of this, you've seen, this was in the 90s when this was going on, and you stuck around with the agency in the superintendent roles for several years after, where you were able to see how this all played out and the impact on the workforce. How do you evaluate how it's gone?
Well, I think it achieved the big thing, which and they might be forgotten about today because, they've kind of become routine, like, oh, this is no big deal. Well, I wouldn't get lazy. At one time when I started in the National Park Service, park rangers were in a different series, but there was when you got a permanent GS5 park ranger job, after a year you got promoted to GS5, to GS7. It was a grade level step, but you were also required to have a college degree in a resource function. I happen to have a forestry degree, but that all went away. So I wouldn't get complacent. It became, kind of sub-professional during the late 80s. I think partly through kind of central office knowledge and awareness of what was going on. It really took us all to be in Washington, D.C. to get it back on track. So I think it would be a mistake to be complacent. B, I would really like to see still, although I don't get too married to these things today, I would still like to see an education requirement in a cultural or natural resource, as I think is a requirement for entry. Although that might be unreasonable, but certainly as a requirement to go beyond the 9 level. Why do I feel that way? Well, it wouldn't be that difficult for somebody to come along and say, well, we can do that ranger work. We can do it cheaper or better. Which is kind of what happened with resource management. Higher grade levels, more credibility dealing with resources than park rangers had, took over a lot of and do a much higher quality job, must admit. But it essentially diminished the park ranger function from having some resource management credibility as part of the grade level in the structure. So it doesn't. It's a kind of a shame to me that ANPR and I don't know, FOP, are they still around?
No, they dissolved a couple years ago or a year ago.
The cadre of protection rangers, law enforcement rangers, I would hope would advocate not just for the law enforcement function. You see on them talking about themselves today as, oh, we're law enforcement. Well, you could easily all of a sudden become 083s. If there was some folks that were either competitors for Rangers or that, office politics and internal competition being what it is, every occupation has to kind of be sure it keeps its credibility and its what it's doing in the limelight.
Sure.
Not just kind of categorized too narrowly.
Well, thanks, Dick. That's kind of the reason I wanted to talk to you today is to get a good background on this, because you're right that one doesn't know at what point in the future that someone could be blindsided by this and come in and say, hey, they have a great plan for revamping the Ranger series, and without knowing how things got to be where they are today, it's a difficult time to try and play catch up at that point.
Yeah, I think that's really true. The function needs some watchdogs. I think probably less true of interpretation. Well, I don't need to go on any longer, Greg. Sorry.
All right. Well, thanks for talking to me today, Dick, and I just greatly appreciate the history lesson and the perspective. Well, campers, that's all for now. Check back for new shows every few days. Breaking news comes out when it happens on Twitter and Facebook. Thanks for listening. And in case you haven't figured it out, NPS Ranger News isn't affiliated with the government. I'm Greg Jackson for NPS Ranger News. See you on the trail.